It's a headline that seems plucked from a Jason Bourne or double-oh-seven movie. Arab rulers and spy chiefs stashed millions in Swiss bank. We have the right person to discuss it with. That would be Graham Barrow. He's an expert in unraveling financial webs with a 25-year history in banking, financial regulation, and financial crime control frameworks. Today, you can find him as the co-host of the Dark Money Files podcast. That's a weekly download covering all aspects of money laundering and financial crimes. Mr. Barrow, thank you so much for joining us from the UK. How unprecedented is this leak from Credit Suisse?
I think I can say with some assurance it is unprecedented for a number of reasons, Mike. We've had leaks before, but this is a bit different.
And different how? Tell me why.
Well, the first one is the location of the leak. I mean, Switzerland is notorious for having been a secrecy location for, decades and decades. Not just secrecy, but they've criminalized the leaking of information out of Swiss banking. So that is unprecedented. And to have access to 18,000 accounts of a whole variety of people who have banked in Switzerland is an extraordinary cache of documents, and one really worth talking about.
Can you provide some history as to how this became the banking niche of the Swiss?
Well, I think it was a perfect storm. Switzerland, obviously, neutral country. It pretty much always has been, so it doesn't ally itself with any particular bloc or group of nations. It has a relatively low economy outside of banking. Banking has always been a particular flavour of the Swiss economy. And it became apparent, I think, pretty early on that providing people with exceptional levels of secrecy attracted lots of money. So, and come on, let's be honest, most of it legitimate. But as we're trying to kind of finding out, not all of it.
Is it a World War II outgrowth, or does it extend beyond that?
I think it started before that. You could go into Switzerland back in the early part of the 20th century and you never even had to say what your name was. They gave you a number. We won't ask, you don't tell us, here's a number. You have access to that account. I mean, it is like out of a James Bond film, and you have that number and you can go and look at your money and sort away your artworks or whatever. And nobody was any the wiser. And of course, there is a history during the Second World War, unfortunately, of collaborating with Nazis and allowing them to get their wealth out of Nazi Germany. And although the rules have changed, and I'm sure we'll talk about those, in a way, the rules have changed, but not much else has.
So this is a leak of 18,000 bank accounts that date from the 1940s until well into the 2010s, but not the bank's current operations. What do we know, if anything, as to the origin of this leak?
Not very much, and I think the OCCRP, which is the organisation it will leak to, and the German newspaper, are being exceptionally careful about that because of the criminal jeopardy the leaker will potentially face. So clearly, it's a leak from within the organisation itself. They have leaked substantial amounts of data. I think a lot of it will never see the light of day simply because of Swiss banking laws, but it's provided the opportunity to write a narrative about some of the people who banked at Credit Suisse, albeit, as Credit Suisse are very keen to point out, not necessarily they're now, but have banked in the past.
Do you read anything into the fact that the timeline for these accounts ends in the 2010s? In other words, maybe that's all that the person responsible for the leak had access to. Part of me wonders whether they wanted to reveal information, but not exactly current information.
I think that's not an unnatural response, and I think it's probably fairly close to the reality. It may also be that the person had access to historical records, but didn't have access to current banking records, and that was the most that they could access. I guess we'll never know, but I think there's something of both of those conjectures.
Graham Barrow, we all have Russia and Ukraine on the brain. One of the things that I didn't see reference to that I had expected to see was Putin or Russian oligarchs. It's other so-called strongmen who are getting all the attention. Is there a Russian connection that you see to Credit Suisse?
I don't, actually. I think in some respects, I don't think they need to, because they have perfectly good access. The UK actually provides a lot of their access to the global market. I think historically, Switzerland hasn't had such a massive Eastern European cadre of account holders. It's clearly attracted people from much of the rest of the world. I think we've seen from previous stories, Mike, around what's been happening in the Baltics particularly. The Russians have got pretty good access to the global market without necessarily going through a Swiss bank account. So I think that's a separate issue, a really important one, but probably from Credit Suisse's point of view, maybe not such a big deal. Obviously, we don't know what's happened since 2010, and maybe that's changed. But looking at this, I'm not overly surprised.
Are you surprised at the absence of well-known American names on the list?
A bit more. Obviously, there's a bit more history there because the legislation in the US has forced, in some respects, the Swiss banks to disclose through FATCA and other US legislation rather more information than they had. So it might be lots of Americans decamped from Credit Suisse and had archived their details, but. Or it may be that they use other Swiss banks. Other Swiss banks are available, but it just may be that Credit Suisse's client base is just more attractive to other parts of the world.
So who is getting the scrutiny? Who did show up on that list?
Well, I mean, there were some Eastern Europeans, because I did a little bit of background work on a family called Ablyazov, who are from Azerbaijan. So there are Azerbaijanis, there are drug lords, there are senior members of intelligence agencies, I think, from places like Venezuela and others. So there's a whole host of individuals who have appeared in the press in rather adverse circumstances over the last 2 or 3 decades. And I guess the thing that's really concerning is that this is not a concentration in one particular country or one particular type of person. It is pretty globally spread, albeit there are a couple of notable absentees.
One example that touches American politics is the fact that the sons of a Pakistani intelligence operative in about the same time period as Americans began funneling money, this was in the Reagan administration, began funneling money to Pakistani intelligence. All of a sudden now a few counts appear in the names of the sons. I think they totaled $3+ million, which seems problematic on the surface. And then you say, well, maybe this was the way in which they were parking money for clandestine purposes. I guess my point is sometimes you really just don't know, based on the presence of the money, what the real purpose of the funds was.
You don't, and that is one of the challenges that banks face. They have a legal requirement to establish the source of the funds that they receive, but sometimes that's extremely difficult to do. And it's equally hard. I mean, you know, there are mechanisms by which corrupt people launder money into the system, and consultancy fees is definitely one of them. It can be really difficult sometimes to work out, are these people taking money from, for example, you know, the US intelligence agencies and actually creaming off a big swipe of it for themselves? Or is it being allocated there because it's going to be put to other intelligence purposes, but they can't be seen to be doing that from out of Pakistan? And I think, you know, there's a conversation about clever, corrupt and criminal actors know exactly how to utilize the financial system to sow those seeds of doubt. So you can never say with great assurance, this is definitively what happened to our money. You can just say on the balance of probabilities, this is probably what happened to our money. There's a very good, actually, the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations did a really good report back in 2020 in the US about breaching sanctions through the art market. And they had to say the same thing. No matter how hard they tried, they could not definitively say the structures were owned, in this case, by the Rottenbergs, who were partners of Putin. But we believe that they are. And that's the problem with secrecy. It does not allow definitive decisions to be made.
Graham, I want to follow up on something you said a moment ago. What exactly is the obligation of a Swiss bank to vet? Let's say that Graham Barrow comes to them and says, I have money I'd like to deposit. Are they under any obligation to try and ferret out who you are?
Yes, but there's this wonderful phrase in all of the legislation, and the Swiss follow the European Union money laundering directive, although they're not a member of the EU, they follow the directive. And the directive said you apply a risk-based approach. There are certain things you must do. You must verify the identity of your client for a start. So you have to know this is definitively who I'm dealing with, and you should understand the source of their funds, and in certain cases, the source of their wealth. The challenge is that those requirements are applied on a risk-sensitive basis. So there's not an absolute mandatory set of facts that you have to gather for every client, but the higher the risk of the client, and clearly people who are exposed politically in their own countries are the highest level of risk, the rules are pretty clear. You must establish for those clients the source of their funds and the source of their wealth. And there are really important distinctions between those two phrases, because source of funds is specifically, where's the money you're giving to us to look after come from? Source of wealth is, how did you acquire all of your wealth? Because clearly, you could potentially validate the funds that you're giving to somebody, but if you're sitting on a pot of criminal funds as well, you can't be sure that the money you're getting is their legitimate money or the criminal money. So that those two things are absolutely essential for these high risk customers.
But the days of walking into Credit Suisse or UBS and not revealing your identity and simply being asked to assign a number, those days are over.
Gone. Absolutely gone. You are forbidden by the law to ever do that. And that's been the case since the 1990s.
So I have been leading you with my questions. Instead, sum up and tell me what Graham Barrow, the co-host of the Dark Money Files podcast, what do you find most significant? What do you want to leave us with?
I think this is really important about the conversation between transparency on the one hand and secrecy on the other. I think there's a psychological aspect to what's come out of Switzerland, which is if you've lived in a country for 50 or more years where secrecy, criminalization of disclosure of banking information is your normal way of doing business, it affects your judgment. Because if you're doing business with somebody and you think there is a reasonable chance that at some point that business might see the light of day, I think you're significantly more careful about the business you do than if you live in a world when, as far as you're concerned, it doesn't matter what you do because it will never be revealed. And I think that encourages risk-taking of far too great an amount, because if you're not going to be held to account publicly, I think you're just more inclined to do business you might not otherwise want to do.
The final question, if I might, have they forced transparency on people who decades ago took advantage of the numbered system, didn't have to reveal their identity? I mean, what if today I'm 90 years old, but I have that numbered bank account? Do they still not know who I am?
No. I mean, the rules were very clear when they were introduced. You had to retrospectively go back and we call it due diligencing. You had to fully due diligence all of your clients. You must not now have any account at any bank that meets, they're called the Financial Action Task Force. It's a pan-global body. You cannot have accounts that do not identify the underlying person who owns the money within that account.
It reminds me that, here in the States, people are accustomed to giving away gift certificates at holiday time. And I read the statistics that are stunning as to how many gift certificates purchased are never redeemed. There's a lot of money left on the table, so to speak. It makes me wonder about accounts that were opened under the old era, numeric only. They didn't know the identity and perhaps were never claimed. It seems to me there's probably a pretty good VIG in there for the Swiss banks.
I don't disagree with a word of what you just said. I bet there are people who had numbered accounts, and even if there was some method of getting in touch with them, are not now prepared to reveal who they were in the first place.
Or died.
I reckon that's a good call.
Or died, and the bank benefited.
Yep.
Well, that was really interesting. Graham Barrow, thank you so much. I wish you good things on your podcast.
Mike, thank you for having me as a guest today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thanks for saying that. Cheers. All right. Well, thank you, sir. We got it done, and we appreciate your patience very much.
Not a problem, Mike. It's absolutely not a problem. Really good to speak to you. And I send greetings from Nina Dos Santos, who's here at CNN in the UK, who I was taping a piece with yesterday.
Oh, that's wonderful. Nice to see you, and thank you.